Good morning. We want to welcome you to the Grove Church Live, and thank you for being with us this morning. We are in our fourth week of our series that we're currently in, and it's the Resurrection Now series, and so this is week 4, and we are excited to have this conversation with you today. We will be moving into a time of worship. And Liz and AJ, they were so kind. Liz recorded some songs for us in advance. They weren't able to be with us this morning. So these will be songs coming from her living room and to you. And so we hope that that will be a good time of worship that we can participate in together. But before we jump into that time with Liz, I wanted to read just a couple things from the book Abba's Child by Brennan Manning. And this will connect to our conversation today about our belovedness in God and how that is who we are at our core. It's who we're called to be and who we're created as. And so I want to read just an introduction to that type of thinking this morning. Let us pause here. It is God who has called us by name. The God beside whose beauty the Grand Canyon is only a shadow has called us his beloved. The God beside whose power the nuclear bomb is nothing has tender feelings for us. We are plunged into mystery with him, and the moment of truth has arrived. The revelation of God's tender feelings for us is not mere dry knowledge, but truth. So when the night is bad and our nerves are shattered, infinity speaks over us. When God Almighty shares through his Son the depths of his feelings for me, when his love flashes into my soul and I am overtaken by the mystery. Turn around and believe that the good news is that we are loved. We are loved better than we ever dared hope, and that to believe in that good news is to live it out and to live toward it and to be in it, to be in the love of the good news. And we are glad in the things of the world. It is the gladdest thing of all. So with that in mind, that we are called his beloved and that the love that he has for us chases after us and comes to find us, even in the dark nights that we face. I would invite you to participate in worshiping with us this morning. We're going to head over to Liz's living room, and we want you to join us in song. So worship with us.
Come out of sadness from wherever you've been. Come broken hearted and let rescue begin. Come find mercy, sinner come near. Earth has no sorrow, heaven can't heal. Earth has no sorrow, heaven can't heal. So lay down your burden. sinner, be still. Earth has no sorrow that heaven can't heal. Earth has no sorrow that heaven can't heal. I'm weary from the waves crashing over every day. God in mercy, please come rescue me. I'm longing for your voice, the gentle whisper in the noise. Father, tell me everything's alright. Your power, your presence, break strongholds, King of heaven. When you speak, mountains move. I believe there will be breakthrough. You alone can take my scars, piece by piece restore my heart. Take what's broken, make it whole again. Your power, your presence, break strongholds, King of heaven. When you speak, mountains move. I believe there will be breakthrough. Shake the mountains, break the walls apart. When the heavens, Almighty God, you are overcomer, defender of my heart. By your power, the oceans open wide. Your fire falls and heaven and earth collide. King Jesus, forever by my side. Your power, your presence, break strongholds, King of heaven. When you speak, mountains move. I believe there will be breakthrough. There will be breakthrough. There will be breakthrough. Dear God, thank you for these songs that serve as reminders. Reminders that you're there for us in the darkest of times. Reminders that we don't have to be perfect. Reminders that we can show up just as broken and messy as we are, and that you will meet us right there in that messy spot. Thank you so much for these songs that are prayers, and sometimes for the songs that are cries out to you, God. Pray all these things in your name. Thank you so much for these reminders. I want to know you, Lord, like I know a friend. I want to know you, Lord. I want to know you, Lord, like I know a friend. I want to know you, Lord. So I'm laying down all my religion. I'm laying down, want to know you, Lord. I'm laying down all my religion. I'm laying down, want to know you, Lord. could box you in, but I'm laying down. Wanna know you, Lord. I used to think that I could box you in, but I'm laying down. Wanna know you, Lord. So I'm laying down all my religion. I'm laying down. Wanna know you, Lord. I'm laying down all my religion. I'm laying down. Wanna know you, Lord. Lord, I've been told to be ashamed. Lord, I've been told don't measure up. Lord, I've been told not good enough. But you're here with me. I reach out and you find me in the dust. Say no amount of untruths can separate us. I reach out and you find me in the dust. Say no amount of untruths can separate us. I will rejoice in the simple gospel. I will rejoice in you, Lord. I will rejoice in the simple gospel. I will rejoice in you, Lord. I reach out and you find me in the dust. To say no amount of untruths can separate us.
So we're in our fourth week of our series, Resurrection Now. This is a series from the Work of the People. They do a 6-part interview with Richard Rohr. And I want to kind of just go back, take a time out and kind of go back and refresh everyone. Some of you, maybe this is the first week you're joining us, or you maybe got kind of lost in the last few weeks. But Richard Rohr is a famous author. He is a Franciscan monk. He is part of the priesthood in the Roman Catholic Church. He would consider himself a Christian mystic. And so several books that he's written that we've talked about at the Grove. Some of the names are The Universal Christ, Falling Upward, Everything Belongs, The Naked Now, The Wisdom Pattern, The Enneagram, The Divine Dance, and What We Do with Evil, and other books that he's written, again, have been referenced before at the Grove. But we're talking about our faith and this need as we enter into a new year to find some life, to bring it alive. And we've been taking each week and kind of walking through pieces of our faith that have maybe lost some of that meaning, lost some of that purpose. And we've through contemplative prayer, brought life back to those and brought purpose back. And I want to walk through what Rohr calls the wisdom pattern. And this is our journey of faith towards wisdom. But I'm going to start with reading a quote, or reading, it's an ancient proverb. And I want you to hear this, and it's going to be on the screen. But I'm going to read it to you, and I want you to have this in your mind for the next few moments and then throughout the remainder of this series. I think it's really important, and it draws all this together. So let me read this to you again. It's going to be on the screen. It says this: "Before I saw mountains as mountains and rivers as rivers, when I arrived at a more intimate knowledge, I came to the point where I saw that mountains are not mountains and rivers are not rivers. But now that I have got its very substance, I am at rest. For it's just that I see mountains once again as mountains and rivers once again as rivers." In this wisdom pattern, Rohr uses the metaphor of these three boxes that start, and I kind of put these together for you here so you can kind of see. And he calls the boxes, starting in the far right, the box number 1, he calls it order. And then the box number 2 in the middle, he calls it disorder. And then the third box is called reorder. And he says this is the pattern for wisdom. Our goal to wisdom is to take our experience and our knowledge, and that's how he defines wisdom. And so in our first box, this is where, and our faith, if we're looking at faith, because this could also be in other pieces of our life, but if we're looking strictly at our faith and our religion, our first box is the basic primitive consciousness. So this is where we're told how to live, what's the difference between right and wrong, how do we think, what do we believe, how we got here, what is our purpose. And so many of us who grew up in church, we start in the first box. This is where traditional churches and conservative churches and even contemporary churches often live in box number 1, and we actually stay there most of our lives. I spent most of my life in this first box. That's where I grew up. The same tradition that I grew up in, we were taught to live in the box because this is all what we knew. This was the faith that was given to us as children. This is our parents' faith. This is where we learned the sayings like, the Bible said it, I believe it, that settles it. Even though we had no idea where in the Bible it may have said it or if it said it at all, we believe that we were taught that in our first box. This is where we insist that there is order, there's structure, even if it's a false sense of order. So if there are things that come along that challenges our personal experience with things, there was still order nonetheless. But in box 1, we felt happy, we felt safe, we felt secure. And then as we move along, and so some of the things that we would find in our box, and I'm going to jump around here, but some of the things we find in our box, and you'll see this on the screen as well. But in your first box, you might find, and this is my box. Your box might be a little bit different. Matt, Jody, Debbie, their box is a little bit different. But for the most part, you'll see some of the things in my box that you might have in yours. So Sunday school, the 10 Commandments, right versus wrong. We had Bible stories like Jonah and the whale, Noah's Ark. We were taught about heaven and hell. How do we pray? Who is God? We were taught that God is love. In my tradition, we were taught that, or I remember hearing things about women not being able to be leaders. We weren't able to ask questions. We weren't able to have doubts. The creation story, the anti-gay, anti-abortion, one way to read the Bible. For many of you, you may have even had, there's only one version of the Bible. For me growing up, the King James Version wasn't a part of my faith tradition. Like I never had a King James Version, but I know some of you have had that in your mind or in your box number 1 growing up, that there was only one version of the Bible. And then again, that idea that the Bible said it, I believe it, that settles it, very firm on that. And then a little bit about what Matt talked about, I think last week, where this idea of being a part of a church. For me, my box 1, it was you had to behave a certain way. You had to believe a certain thing before you could even belong to a place. And so that was my box number 1. And I put a few things out there that we've talked about in this series so far. Prayer, the Bible, God is love, and then we're going to get into the topic of original sin this morning. So that was our first box. And Rohr talks about this idea that also in a point in our journey in our faith, we begin to ask questions, and things don't make sense anymore. Things that we learned in our first box just aren't adding up, and we begin to ask questions, and we begin to have these doubts, and we begin to relook at things. And so some of the things that we find in box number 2, we ask questions like, why do I pray? Or why should I go to church? What's up with this hell thing? What about evolution? What about pro-life? What does that really mean for life outside of the womb? We don't talk a lot about that in box number 1, but box number 2, we ask those questions. Is the Bible wrong? Is it scientific? Is it historically accurate? We have questions about LGBTQ Christians. Is that a thing? Box number 1 said no, but box number 2 is asking these questions of why is there racism in our church? Why is there church abuse, a history of church abuse all over the world? These things don't make sense for what I've been taught in box number 2. And then we find box number 3. This is, so we've moved from order to disorder to then reorder. And what Rohr is saying is that there's this place where we hold in the tension of the knowledge that we've learned, the experience of our lives, wrestle together, and we come into this box of reorder to then find what we believe, what we wrestle with our beliefs, and then we come out knowing or seeing things a lot differently. So again, in my first box, I had some of the things that we've talked about in this series, and we've questioned it, we've wrestled it, and we've come out with some different things. And so in box 3, you might find, for me, this is what I find in my third box of reorder is contemplative prayer, contemplative prayer, a new focus on it where everything I do is in direct union with God in the moment. So it's intentional. It's focused time. It's not where prayer was, and I'll get a little bit more on that in a moment. But we talked about Bible filters, what we bring to Scripture when we read it, who we are when we're reading the Bible. Jesus hermeneutics for me is in box number 3. That's how I read the Bible, is through the lens of Jesus. Words like the beloved community, inclusion, having a bigger table, the idea that God is love and that love wins, non-dualism in the universe, everything being spiritual. Those are things that I would find in my third box. And Rohr is clear that box number 1 is essential. All 3 boxes are important, but we all must start in the first box. We build a container that can hold it. And so the stories of our faith, our childhood, all those things are important things that we learn, right and wrong, black and white. We learn those things. But through our journey, we question, we have doubts, we wrestle when things don't make sense. And we can't get to box 3, we can't get to reorder without going from order to disorder, then back to reorder. So back to the first one, the prayer. For me, in order, I was taught how to pray, why to pray, how long to pray. It was very much a formula. It was structured. It was organized. It was public. It wasn't something we did in private. It was like out there for display. In disorder, I felt that there was no connection, no meaning. It was just transactional. It was an obligation, and then I saw its use was sometimes abusive, and then it was petty. When I saw what certain things people would be praying for, or we were told to pray for, seemed petty to me. And as it went through that disorder, it came out into reorder, where I wanted to be more intentional with my prayers. And so contemplative prayer is, again, the rewiring of the mind so that everything I do is connected in loving union with God in the moment. It's very intentional. It's often maybe meditation. It's focus, and that's what prayer I want for me, for it to be for me. We talked about the Bible the second week. For me, in the box of order, the Bible there's one way to interpret it. You had to read it literally, like everything was there. It was scientific, it was factual, it was historically accurate. For you, it may have been, again, the King James Version only. Disorder for me began, there was no answers. This wasn't scientific. This wasn't historically accurate. There were multiple interpretations that were there, and those questions came. And so I've come back out through reorder with being aware of the filters that I bring to the Scripture. That I'm a male, that I'm a husband, that I'm a father, that I'm not poor, I'm privileged. All these things come into it when I read the Bible, and I cannot not read those and be those when I read Scripture. So I'm aware of these filters. I'm aware that there are multiple ways to apply the teachings of Jesus, and there's not just one way. And again, the word Jesus hermeneutic, and we're going to talk a lot about this next week, is having this idea that when I read Scripture, I read it the way Jesus read it. I read it through the filter of Jesus. And so that's how the Bible journey was for me. Last week we talked about this idea of who is God. And I'm taught in my first box that God is love. But I also was taught that he was wrathful, that he was jealous, that he hated gay people, that he was a vengeful God, that he was an angry God. But then I started questioning things about if God is love, then why is there pain and suffering in the world? Why is there injustice? Why are people who claim to follow God not very loving if God is love? And then through the box of reorder, I've come to be aware that the universe, the structure of the universe is love itself. And love is law, the law fulfilled. That God is love, that we breathe love in and we breathe love out. And so for me, I started with God as love, and I end with God as love as well, but I see it differently. And today we're going to talk about the doctrine of original blessing and original sin. And as you can see in my first box, I started with original sin, and I came out with original blessing. And I'm going to share a little bit more about that here in a moment. But all the boxes, again, are important for our journey. We all start in a box, and sometimes our third box looks a lot like our first box, and that's okay. But often it looks different, or things look different. And so I want you to think about this practically. If you can imagine 20 years into marriage, Jody and I we're about 21, we're almost 21 years into marriage. But if you can imagine being 20 years into your marriage, and if Jody still thought that I was perfect, like 20 years into it, she still thought I was perfect. Like, that would, how unhealthy would that marriage be, right? Like if she still thought that, or or your marriage, like how unhealthy would that be if 20 years down the road, you still thought your spouse was perfect? I feel like that's the same when it comes to our faith. 5 years in, 10 years in, 15, 20 years in, if you believe everything is the same that it was when you were first taught, chances are that there's probably some unhealthiness in there, that you haven't had very open hands when it comes to learning about God and understanding God, and you've held on to some things a lot tighter than needs to be, and your understanding of God, if that hasn't changed or you don't see things differently, I would say that that's probably not healthy. An unhealthy church doubles down on box number one. And it's usually a false order. But they double down on it and they say no questions, you can't doubt things, there's no diversity, you got to just believe our interpretation, and there's only one way to do this, and we get stuck in there. A lot of conservatives, we are whether it's traditional, contemporary churches, we get stuck in there. We have a hard time leaving that box because of the safety and security in that box. But a healthy church encourages questions, encourages wrestling. It provides space for those who want to critique God. That there are different ways of reading and applying what Jesus taught, and we want to be a healthy church. And so this is the wisdom pattern in which Rohr talks about. But again, that proverb that we started with. Before I saw mountains as mountains and rivers as rivers, but when I arrived at a more intimate knowledge, I came to the point where I saw that mountains are not mountains and rivers are not rivers. But now that I have got its very substance, I am at rest, for it's just that I see mountains once again as mountains and rivers once again as rivers. I've hoped that you've enjoyed the series so far, where what we're in. Again, today we're talking about original blessing and original sin, and those might be brand new to you. Those words may be things you've never heard before, so I want to quickly give you a definition of what those mean. But this is our story of faith. This is your story of faith. We have to choose whether we're going to travel through this journey, through these boxes, or we're just going to stay put where we're at. Often, many progressives and liberals get stuck in box number 2. They just live in the disorder. They question everything, and then they throw everything away, and then they walk away. They don't give it time to maybe reorder what they once learned. And we're just scratching the surface on these things. What we're going to talk about today, what we talked about the last 3 weeks, we've barely just scratched the surface on these topics. There's so much out there to read and to listen to and to expand your knowledge on and your experience with. And so we don't have a lot of time on Sunday mornings to do that, but we're trying to provide just maybe some spark for you to start thinking and start questioning and start doubting. We want to encourage that. And so today, again, original sin and original blessing. This is original sin. This might sound familiar. The words, the original sin might not sound familiar. The doctrine, original sin, might be new to you, but this is what it is. And so this might remind you of what you've been taught. That we're born with sin nature, that we are separated from God, that Jesus' death is the only way. In its most basic terms, the doctrine of original sin argues 2 things. One, that when Adam and Eve ate the fruit in the garden, something negatively and permanently shifted in their nature. And 2, this nature has been passed on to every human being since. So the doctrine of original sin is not simply a confession of sin, because I think we would all say that we all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. This is not just saying that, but it's a declaration that human nature is predisposed to sin. Most of us have grown up with a version of Christianity where original sin was assumed. You may be surprised to learn that the church flourished for 4 centuries without any concept of original sin at all. If we were to look at the Apostles' Creed or the 9-Seed Creed, the earliest affirmations of our Christian faith, nothing points to belief in an inborn, fallen state of humanity. I believe that we've all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, but I do not believe that we start evil. I believe we are created in the image of God and with the nature of the divine inside of us. That's original sin. Here's original blessing. The gospel is not a story of us being separated by sin from God. It's the story of a God who is so faithfully for us and intent on being with us that God became human to help us embody the wholeness and fullness of life we've been made for. It's not a story of separation. It's a story of invitation and participation. And that's from Daniel Schroer in her book, Original Blessing. So again, just to kind of be clear, one thing I wanted to say was that, the box of reorder, it's not a reshaping of our faith in a way that caters better to my individual needs or to your individual needs. That's not what we're talking about. We're not changing things just to make me feel better. But through experience and through knowledge, the wisdom path, the pattern is to be able to hold those things in tension and come out seeing things just a little bit different. And so again, we're gonna talk a little bit more about this original sin, original blessing here. I want you to watch this quick video from Richard Rohr, part of our series, and then the group's gonna come back together and we're gonna ask a few questions and talk together.
What our own Franciscan tradition saw, especially the great theologian, philosopher St. Bonaventure, who was building on Francis, saw, was that the end had to be the same as the beginning. Alpha and Omega had to be the same thing. How it starts is where it has to return. He said his whole theology was emanation, everything emanates from God, exemplification, everything exemplifies God, and consummation, everything returns to God. Right? Now that's a coherent universe. That's a benevolent universe where God really wins, where God really is victorious. But if you don't have that kind of coherence, if you don't have that kind of joy or optimism at the foundation, God created it and it was good, which is said 6 times in a row. God created it and it was good, 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 and it was good. And we came along. I'm not trying to be anti-Protestant, but Luther says we're a pile of manure and Christ is the snow that covers the manure. Now, Luther was a spiritual genius, but his anthropology was terrible, terrible, you know? If you're basically a pile of manure, how do you redeem that? Grace is not inherent to the universe.
You can grow flowers.
Yeah. In Franciscan theology, which I think is very biblical theology, starting with Genesis 1:2, the Spirit is hovering over the chaos and turning it into light. Right? It's good from the beginning. Our starting point is not original sin, a phrase created 4 centuries later by Augustine, but in fact is original blessing, as Matthew Fox so wisely said years ago. So we're working hard to get back to the original blessing. See, if you start with no, if you start with negation, accusation, judgment, and again, watch your own mind. If you start the conversation with an immediate dismissal of a person or an idea, you start with no, it's almost impossible to get back to yes. It is. In fact, they now have evidence. Now, again, I'm going to show my weak science. But do you know when you have a strong, angry, or negative reaction, we can now prove that hormones are released in your body, and it probably takes 4 to 6 hours for you to return to homeostasis. That's why, you had a fight with your wife at 7 o'clock. You're still negative at 9 o'clock. You are. And you wonder why you are. We now have physiological evidence for that. You're inside of another force field and you wonder why you're so negative. You can't afford to do that. Well, when you start with no, you start with the universe is a great big reward punishment system, and God, by the criteria of most of our churches, let's be honest, 99.2% of everything God has created since the beginning of time is damned to hell.
Our God.
Our God is an awesome God. Yeah, it doesn't work. It just doesn't work. It's over. And I'm a Christian, but I've been graced to be in touch with the mystical Christian tradition, the Franciscan tradition, the philosophical and theological tradition, which never went there. But unfortunately, the mass-produced fast food Christianity that most of us were given in our corner churches was of that fast food variety. A quick reward-punishment explanation. Emphasizing the punishment, by the way. That was supposed to motivate us.
So I'd like to welcome you back and also welcome Debbie and Matt and Jody to the conversation this morning. Real quick, the 3 boxes. What do you guys think? Any thoughts? Anything you want to add or take away from that? Or what's that? Do you guys have anything?
The one thing I would add is that being now in the reorder box, I realize that the first definition of God is that we are loved deeply. And if we can start there, the other 2 boxes don't seem to start with that, even though my upbringing meant well. So reorder is the genuine place where you find out that you are extremely loved.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you.
I would say that it's often either an intentional, you hear something like what we're talking about today, or you read something, you're coming into contact with someone, or some kind of deep suffering or surprise or transition is what causes us to even realize there's another box. It's not always something that we can go to that we've thought to reorder, but if we can do that on our own rather than having life shock us into that moment, then we're actually better prepared for that moment of tragedy or that moment of pain or suffering. And then the only other thing, aside from the fact that I love your handwriting, Jeff, and I wish I had it as a font saved on my computer, is that we don't often take everything out of the first box and then work it through. So we can take something like prayer and work it through disorder, and we can work it through reorder until we have to, wait, I've got to go back and look at the Bible now
Right.
and work that through.
Right. Yeah, it's a continual process where we may back to this, back to things we never thought about. Like, I never considered changing this until I went through this process and I realized, oh wow, that I got to shift that back too. And so, yeah, good. Anything?
I would concur.
Okay.
I agree.
So let's jump into this conversation here, this video we just watched. Debbie, I want you to respond to this quote, and then Matt and Jody, you can add to that. Here's the quote. If you start with no, if you start with accusation, negation, judgment, if you start the conversation with an immediate dismissal of a person or idea, it's almost impossible to get back to yes. It is. Respond to that quote.
When I was a middle school principal, I was in charge of the angry parent who was going to come and tell us all the things we were doing wrong. And so after having done it probably many times the wrong way, I learned a trick. So the angry parent walks in with clear conviction about what he or she is upset about. And I just received them calmly and sat and listened. And my rule for myself was listen until they run out of steam and until they actually get quiet for a moment. And so the quote says, if you start with no, you dismiss them. So, of course, I might have had the school, maybe our position was correct, maybe what we did to the child was correct, maybe our rule was correct, but still, if I dismissed the parent and their concern before I heard it, there was no way that I was going to sell anything that was good to them. So once you listen and you pay attention and you find out one thing that you can say, oh, I see how you felt that way, then you start to build a bridge. So it was starting with yes, the parent is somehow rightfully here, and it's my job to hear them.
Yeah, I think that's key. Being married to a theater teacher has its perks, and I've been able to watch her engage with a lot of folks in creation. And there's a difference between a play that's already been scripted out and set, and the characters are learning lines and learning how to live in that. There's a difference between that and improvisational comedy, which some of you have watched, like Whose Line Is It Anyway, where a story is continuing to be told. The key to that is when someone says something to you, no matter how outlandish or whatever, the response is always yes and. And I think in so many times our faith aren't allowed to blossom into the stories that God wants to write with us because we are given something and our response is no, and it shuts it down. If you've ever seen that on a stage when somebody comes with a negative piece, everything just grinds to a stop. There's nowhere to go. It's awkward. It's not going to continue. But if you can do yes, just hear it like you said. You are a person created in the image of God, worthy of dignity, and therefore I should look at you, hear you, and acknowledge that. Yes. And we're going to work together to fix your kid who's trying to burn down the school. But yeah, so I think our faith's got to move in that kind of way.
Yeah. I think that this quality is so often and very commonly found in church circles because it is uncomfortable if we seem like we're unsteady or we're like on shaky ground if we don't know what we know. So for someone who believes what they believe or is taught to believe, maybe box number one, this is how it is, this is what we believe, you're always going to start with a no. I'm not open to your idea because this is what I know is true and I can't even listen to what you might have to offer. So there's this component, one of the things I was thinking about when you're talking about the boxes, and this is missing in so many of our adult people walking around, myself included in moments. But the emotional maturity to like pause, let me hear what you have to say, instead of assuming that I know more than you. Because really we're assuming that we know more than someone else if we start with a no, they're wrong. Like, no, I don't care what they're about to say to me, they're wrong because I know what I know. And it's that visual picture of this clenching of fists that is a posture that you can really just walk around life with and take into conversations. But when you find that freedom to just release, you would be surprised at the beautiful things you learn about people, because you can be open to what they might have to offer as God's child, not knowing that you think you know more than they do.
Yeah, and I'm brought back to this pattern of wisdom, and I see this so often in our faith when we have conversations about, what we've learned in box number 1, and if we're unwilling to even think there's another way to consider that, it's almost impossible to ever reconsider it. Like Jody said, the historically theological words that hold on loosely but don't let go. If you cling too tightly, you're going to lose control. I think that was the Theologian 38 special. Shared that with us, that idea that if you hold on loosely to your beliefs, we're not asking you to let them go, but hold on loosely. Because if you do cling too tightly, you'll ultimately lose control, because that's what you're after. You're not after truth, you're after control. And I want to control God in box number 1, and that's what we do. So thank you guys. Matt, I want you to respond to this quote. When Rohr said, "When you start with no, you start with the universe is a great big reward punishment system, and 99.2% of everything that God created from the beginning of the universe is damned to hell." What's your response to that quote?
There's a lot in there to unpack, was the first thing I would say. Woo, good question. So this is kind of the difference that he makes mention of between starting with Genesis 3 and Genesis 1. And once you start with Genesis 3 instead of Genesis 1, in other words, the consequences of what we call the fall. By the way, that understanding of the fall was not present in the Jewish thought leading up to Jesus, and primarily wasn't present in the early church. That was Greek thought superimposed onto Hebrew thought. Let me say it this way. If you look at the very dynamism, the way that creation is focused, let's say you want to read it a literal 6 24-hour day, right? Let's just say there. You can't argue with the fact that God creates it, looks back at it, it was good, and it was day 1. Same thing, day 2, 3, 4, 5, day 6, looks back at it and says it was very good. So the Hebrew idea of good is that it's continually in flux, dynamic, and it can actually become better. So why would a God start with a creation that can't get better? The Greek concept of God, or theos, think of Zeus, whatever, is not good, it's perfect. And we bring that into the creation account, but it never said Eden was perfect. It never says that man and woman were perfect. And the problem is, if you start with perfect, you can either just continue that or it's a fall.
Right.
When you start with the good, right, then you can recover that. But if you start with the fall, all you can ever do is get back to where you once were. So I think it's important to understand, and we won't get into this, that you may not discuss this with your family on a pretty basic, conversation at dinner or in the drive-through waiting on your nuggets. But this was a major conversation throughout history with philosophers and theologians. But to get it back to a personal note, you only have to look at the metaphor as God as lover or God as father. And you might say, well, you don't get to do that. And I'm like, I kind of do, because Jesus says, this is our Father who is in heaven. Let me tell you about him, right? I kind of do get to say that we get to look at God through the lens of our earthly relationships, because that's how God has presented God's self to us. So if you start with a kid with no, that kid will never be able to reach the perfection that you've set out for that kid. Whereas instead, if you understand and are not surprised by the kid's going to make mistakes, the kid's going to do great things, it's going to be this uneven place, and we celebrate and are with this kid, and all the way through it, it's not our wrath as a father or a mother that characterizes our relationship, but instead love, then that has somewhere to go.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Why not with our God? So think about God in this idea of your spouse or lover as your friend, as your father or mother. And it's not because God's revealed God's self that way, it's not wrong for us to put the qualifications and the understandings and the expectations we have on a good father to our heavenly Father.
Yeah.
Let's go ahead and show the second clip of this video, and then I got another quote that I want to hear from this group respond to. So let's watch the second part.
Supposed to motivate us. Do you know the reason you have no notion of hell in Paul's writings, which is shocking for most people to discover? He might have some indirect phrases that could be construed that way, but he never uses the word hell at all. Is because the way the first generation was motivated, you see this in Thessalonians in particular, is they were immediately expecting the return of Christ. That's going to motivate. The game's almost over, so let's just live this life with the few years we have remaining. After the failure of Jesus to return in that first generation, preachers needed something else to motivate the boys, you know? Well, there's no better motivation if you're fathers, you understand this, than a little threat from daddy. Threaten the boys and they'll get whipped into shape. And so we've wasted, hundreds of years preaching fire and brimstone, which made people not love God, but fear God. That's what I mean by starting with no. Now you start with yes, the announcement of a benevolent universe. God created it and it was good. Your core is not bad, it's good. Now you got something to go back to. You got something to fall into. Now our word for that was the soul. The soul is that part of you that knows who it is, that inherently, intuitively, instinctively knows, I'm God's boy. I'm God's daughter. I'm a beloved son. I'm a beloved woman. When you always have that as home base, I'm going to say it, you're basically indestructible. All you have to do is keep teaching people to go back to home base. But what we have now is the home base is lethal. So I can't tell you to go inside. I can't tell you to pray quietly. I mean, a lot of evangelicals call prayer quiet diabolical. Well, I can see why. Because if you really go inside, you're going to discover, I don't really love God. In fact, there's a part of me that doesn't even like God. And I've had people say that right in front of me, that I've never had the courage to say this, but God, as God has been presented to me, is not likable. The only reason I joined is because I felt I had no choice, But would I want to spend a night of quiet, as Jesus did when he goes into the desert alone? Most Christians are scared to death. Did you read that study recently? Now let me remember it right. I so often don't. That they gave a group of men and women a choice between an hour of total quiet and solitude and being shocked, with not a shock that would kill them, but it would, be uncomfortable. If I remember the numbers right, 66 to 68% of the men said, I'll take the shock. Yes, I'll take the shock rather than be 1 hour alone with my own thoughts and silence. It was 50-some% of women. A higher percentage of women could imagine it. But does this tell you the state of the male? I don't want to go inside, because if I really go to the bottom, I don't think I'm going to like what I find there. You see, most of your wounds, most of your real operative theology is hidden in the unconscious. It's operative without being really brought to the conscious level. Now, what you're doing in contemplation is unloading all of that, bringing it up for observation, not hatred, not judgment, just observation. Look at that. I realize I'm actually pretty angry at God, if I'd be honest. Now, where does that come from? Now, maybe you got to then go a little deeper to find out, oh my gosh, I always thought that God was masculine. My dad was a rageaholic. My dad was a violent man. I transferred my God image to my father, or the other way around. Now, that's big stuff, you understand? But we better be honest and start dealing with that, because it doesn't go away. It's still operative in a high percentage of our lives.
So there's a lot there. We don't have much time to go through all of it, but I do want to ask one question to the panel. I want to read a couple of quotes from there, and I want you to kind of respond to these quotes. They fall in the kind of the same theme. He says, when you start with yes, the announcement of a benevolent universe, God created it and it was good. Your core is not bad, it's good. Now you got something to go back to. You got something to fall into. This idea of a home base. The soul is the part of you that knows who it is. Inherently, intuitively, instinctively knows I'm God's son. I'm God's beloved son. I'm God's beloved daughter. When you have that as your home base, all you have to do is keep teaching people to go back to their home base. Mm-hmm. Respond to that quote.
Well, it's such a beautiful picture, and it's a hopeful picture to hang on to. And sadly, that is a picture that we are not taught to hang in our gallery. You know, it is one that is avoided. It's easier to teach someone that they're not good. We all believe that. And the reason why we're so quick to believe that is because that is what our culture has taught us. That is what our upbringings have taught us. That is what our peers, and that is what our self-talk teaches us. I mean, if you ever just think about what you say to yourself, you know, over and over and over again, I mean, we are flooded with believing that we are not good, that we aren't good at our core. So when you look at this announcement that God, it comes with this benevolent universe to say, no, this is who you are. Like, let's just start with that. Like, that's what we come back to. And you pay attention to what is in your soul. I think we could all feel that spark. That's what we're drawn to. We talked about this last week, that the shape of the universe is love. We are drawn to go back to love. That's the journey home. So if the journey home is to find that and to connect with that, it is the goodness of our core that draws us back to that. It is the divine imprint that is uniquely ours, as in every individual human. So if that imprint is there, that is the core. That's the naming. That's, you know, when God names us and when He calls us the beloved, it's the universal love that everybody has.
Original blessing.
The original blessing.
Debbie?
Let me put it in practical terms, because now you leave here and you go back to your family, back to your job. Think of teenagers that you are somehow responsible for, and they ask things, and your first instinct is to say no. And so what it builds in them is antagonism, whether that's deserved or not, antagonism toward you. And so I used to tell teachers and parents, what if you always start with yes and only say no if there's a very good reason and you can share that reason? How different it is to do everything in your power to avoid antagonism. I think that's how God is with us. And so I think when you're moving into your original blessing, contemplative prayer, if you're really listening to Him, He is the most gentle corrector that you can find. He corrects us without ever creating antagonism, because He somehow helps you to see exactly why his answer is what it is. So I just would offer that. Practice it on your teenager, on your coworker, on your spouse, and then you'll know what God is doing for you or wants to do for you.
Yeah, I think it's that identity, that home basis. Rohr says it, that we have to return to. And I think just start listening. If you're a part of a church like I grew up in, just start listening to how often the idea that you're beloved or you're made in the image of God is pushed aside. Just start listening to the voices in your life, whether they're through the way you read the Bible or somebody's teaching it or those kind of pieces. And when they start with totally depraved or they start with sin, okay, sin's a real thing. We hurt ourselves by falling short of the mark. But it should not impugn who we are as individuals. Mm-hmm. And I would encourage you, the voices that continue to say you're no good, that you're damned, that you're broken and fallen, okay? And I would continue to start editing those out of your life. Mm-hmm. I would start finding people who say, yes, we're all broken, but we're in rebuild mode. We're in reordering mode. That this is not who you are. Let's call ourselves into a new creature under Christ. Start prioritizing those voices. Mm-hmm. And be sure that the voice you're speaking to people is you're God's beloved and not you're damned or you're this or that.
If God himself or God itself called us good, like who are we to like switch that and change that to you're not? I mean, where do we get the idea that we could just, change what God had called good? So we're going to end with contemplative prayer practice. Jody's going to walk us through this, but again, every week we end with this where we're taking a moment to rewire our minds, to get focused, to be connected with the divine in the moment. And often these are through meditations or breathing, where last week we talked about the idea of being able to listen to our bodies and feel our bodies. And so Jody's going to lead us through this real quick, and we'll end with that. But thank you for being a part of it, and we hope that you are getting something out of this series, and hope that it's challenging you, pushing you, causing you to wrestle with pieces of your faith, because I feel like that's healthy for us to do. So Jody, would you mind leading us?
Yep. So today we're going to practice just a quick, it's called the quick coherence technique. And what that really kind of boils down to is that often we do not pay attention to what's going on in our bodies, in our hearts, and in our minds. We may individually kind of feel them in different ways, like you hurt your knee, okay, I pay attention to that, or something that you're thinking of, like a reoccurring thought. But the cohesion of bringing those together is something that we have to practice, because otherwise we can be pretty disjointed as humans, as following Christ. It's kind of natural to us. So this technique is a way to kind of bring our bodies in a state of coherence, where we're attempting to kind of steady our hearts, the heart rate, and synchronizing our breath with our body. And so the goal here is that we're bringing our attention to both our hearts and our minds, and that connection is to really a vehicle to transform or to transition the stress that we might be feeling in a more authentic way, to care for ourselves, to be resilient with the things that we might be feeling. So what I want us to do to get started here is, wherever you might be sitting, if you maybe could uncross your legs and just kind of let your hands fall into your lap. Maybe relax your shoulders and not try to hold like tension, but just kind of relax your body, your physical body. And what I want us to do first is just to begin by imagining that you're focusing your heart, you're focusing your energy on what's going around your heart. So you might want to just take your hand and place it on your chest just to physically feel that. Or you might want to just take your mind and think about your heart, focusing the attention around your heart. And as you maintain this focus, what we're going to do together is we're just going to imagine that our breath is really flowing in and out of our bodies, specifically around our hearts. So do this with me. We're going to inhale, and as we do that, hold that inhale, and then let's take a big exhale. And let's do that again, and I'm going to count, and so if you could just take your breath to that place. So inhale, 2, 3, 4, 5, and exhale, 2, 3, 4, 5. And you might feel your hand on your chest, like as you take that big inhale and you take that exhale, you're actually feeling your physical body move. So continue breathing as I tell you what we're going to take our thoughts to next. The next thing as you're breathing that I want us to do is to think about a genuine feeling of appreciation or care that you have for someone, or maybe it's something in your life that really brings back a very beautiful, positive feeling about yourself. So it's a memory, it's a moment. And I want us to make a sincere attempt to relive that feeling, to think about that moment. Maybe it was something God spoke to you. Maybe it was a moment you shared with your family. So as you continue to breathe, maybe close your eyes at this moment, taking that inhale and extending it. And then as you exhale, holding that thought or that memory, that positive moment that you're thinking and reliving that. And I want you to imagine that you're just holding that right there in your heart, that you could almost reach out and grab it. And inhale and exhale. So as you open your eyes and maybe place your hands back into your lap, I want you to think about how you feel. It's just a quick practice, but it's a beautiful way to remember that our bodies are so connected. So it doesn't take a lot of effort to put your hand on your heart and to slow down and take a deep breath. This is something that we can do throughout our day. This is something that we can, take a moment and just remember that there's so many beautiful things that we've experienced, even if you're walking through an incredibly hard time or a season of darkness or a season of doubt. Maybe you're stuck in that middle box and it just seems like it's never going to come back. But God has planted things in each one of us, memories, moments, experiences that we can relive just by allowing our thoughts to go back to that place and feeling that connection to our heart. And so I would encourage you to take this simple practice. It's just a really simple exercise of contemplation and prayer, and let God bring back moments to your heart this week that you perhaps haven't thought of, that bring you great joy. And so I want to commission you with this as we end our time today. I bless you to enjoy experimenting with the benevolent God and lavishing on that and in that today. Amen. So thank you for being with us. We appreciate this time and conversation. It was a huge conversation and so much more that we could unpack, but I would love for you to take this practice, a simple practice with you, to be reminded that you are good, that you are loved, and we are called the beloved of God. So I hope you have a great day, and we will see you back next week.